So finally today, moving on from the destruction of the planet to the reconstruction of the planet, let's take a look at the National Forest. Located in central England, the National Forest is a 200 square mile environmental project that sits smack dab in the middle of a former mine. Yes, a mine. A few million trees later, and it's now a veritable oasis that has not only boosted the health of both people and planet, but indeed the economy as well. John Everett, the chief executive of the National Forest, joined us to offer up further insight into this incredible project. Take a look.
The idea really is about trying to get this whole approach to sustainability working from the community upwards. It was very much a test bed for how you can do environmentally led regeneration. And the reason that it came to this part of the Midlands in England was because of community support, and people wanted it here. And they'd had decades of heavy industry, coal mining, clay mining, aggregate extraction, granite extraction. And the idea was to say, well, how do you restore that landscape? And how do you restore it to something which would set us up for the future and set up the economy and the community development alongside the environmental change? And that's really what's happened. And tree planting has been the key to it. It's been the thing that's bound everyone together into an initiative that they can buy into.
So I'm curious, I mean, with mining practices, it completely depletes the land. So how were you even able to get trees and things to grow back into these depleted soil areas?
Well, our restoration policies are very good here. So when we see the end of mining, particularly coal mining, there is a requirement to restore the land to a particular use. And rather than restore it to agriculture or other industrial use, we've got policies here which have helped to restore it to the forest. And yes, obviously, when you look at open cast coal mining particularly, you've got huge cavities, you've got huge landscape which has been scarred by that mining, and that needs to be infilled. It needs to have topsoil. There are big lakes where you've got large holes in the ground, etc. So it's quite a complicated process of environmental restoration.
So, and I guess that would touch upon the idea that Britain just has better policies on those things than the US, which is not surprising. But there's been a lot of talk in the US about this idea about just transition, and we've covered it on our show as well. So how is the National Forest not just addressing the climate change issue, but also building economic opportunities from this environmental transition?
Yeah, that's really important for us. It would be, in some ways, it's quite easy to do the environmental restoration. I know it doesn't always happen, but as a process, it's well known, and it's been happening for decades now. So we're very good at environmental restoration. What we're not so good at, I think, is then making that central to the economy, and the idea that you can do things like have a long distance trail, you can have quality accommodation, you can have specialist attractions that deal with outdoor learning and environmental education, you can get people to do bushcraft and new woodland skills, you can build a woodland economy because you've now got trees that are 25 years old and they need thinning, and you start to build a new economy on the back of it. So the idea is very much to say, how do we still promote growth, but how do we promote the right kind of growth? Because it's about promoting a sustainable future rather than how do we encourage businesses to come here, which actually would detract from the forest.
Right, so it's basically going at it from a different angle as opposed to the very typical capitalist angle of how can we just make money in the short term. And
yeah, our approach is to say we're not against growth, but we need to see it that it's growth that delivers both public benefits and the right kind of jobs. And so it's been about trying to change mindsets and encourage people to not just do business as usual and then give some support to what we're trying to do, but integrate so that the businesses actually are the ones who are delivering. What's interesting in this setup is the National Forest Company, this organisation is very, very small. There's only about 25 people here. We don't do all the delivery. We have to convince others to do it. So all of that forest creation pretty much, and the management now is being done by landowners, farmers, private sector organisations, and our local authorities and public sector bodies, as well as the voluntary and community bodies. So, that's real integration, and it is very exciting because it does feel really different.
So you mentioned briefly this idea of it's sort of been a community up process. Talk a bit about the importance of having this grassroots and community support.
Well, it's been essential actually to have that. We could have set up a process where we said, or government said, and we were supported by government. So government would have said that we want to have this initiative. Let's go and put a forest in the middle of these communities in the Midlands, whether they like it or not. And that would have been, I think, a complete failure. What we needed to do was quite a bit of groundwork to explain what we're trying. What's this crazy idea about putting a new forest in the middle of the country, and why is that good for communities? Why is it good for business? Why is it good for the landscape? And what that's meant is that we've had very little conflict. So you can imagine the conflict between people saying we shouldn't be taking land out of agricultural production, we should be building houses on this land, we should be having other uses rather than forestry and woodlands. But actually a lot of that conflict has been dealt with because we did a lot of that consultation and understanding and communication. And now we feel there's a huge amount of community pride in what we're doing. People want to be part of the forest, want to feel part of it. But looking at our next 25 years, we have to do even more of that. I think there's a new generation actually growing up who are growing up with an emerging forest. The previous generation grew up with a scarred landscape and saw the forest develop. This generation are growing up with something that they think, well, this has probably been here for decades and maybe even hundreds of years. Some of the landscape looks much more mature now. So how do we engage those communities now in understanding the cycle of woodlands and that they need management, but also they can provide all of these resources and all of these benefits? And that's a challenge for us now.
So do you see this as a possibility? I mean, this is such an interesting and unique idea, and yet it's one of those ideas that you look at and you're like, well, that's just a really good idea. Why haven't we done this like a million times over? Yeah. Do you see this as being replicated in other places in Britain or possibly even other countries? I mean, I would love to see it done in the US.
I think you can take the model and you can roll it out elsewhere, and we're really keen to do that. We think it's incredibly good value for money. You were talking about that earlier, how if you invest in the right place at the right time and in the right way, then you don't have to pay all the sort of ecological clear-up of things that are damaging. It's a bit like building, for some people, the mentality is a bit like building roads or other infrastructure. They're the engines for growth, aren't they, for revenue growth. For us, the engine is investing in the forest. That then drives revenue growth. That means you don't have to invest in cleaning up watercourses. You don't have to invest in dealing with flood risk management. You don't have to invest in public health because the population is healthier because they're out active in the forest. That's the mentality we really want to get across, and that's really exciting. Actually, quite radical for the sort of big scale thinking.
So finally, I mean, you mentioned that there are certain, that just happened that the criteria lined up well for the National Forest to start. What are some of these criteria that you would look for in, let's say, like an open pit mine, previous open pit mine?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess one of the differences between what we're doing here in the US is scale. 200 square miles is quite a large area for us. Probably from a US point of view, it's a much sort of smaller scale scheme. But actually working on that sort of scale, I think, is really interesting because it starts to bring people in. It has to bring people in who are operating at that level. So our public authorities, our health authorities, our transport system, all of those people need to be engaged. So there's something about having scale, which I think is useful. The other thing, I suppose, has been the nature of the landscape. Because it was so beaten up, there was no real sense of people feeling that we didn't want to do this. something had to be done to shift what was an economy that had died, really. The coal extraction industry was on its last legs, really. And so there was a sense that we've got to do something, and this vision fitted at the right time. And I suppose also there's obviously some issues around clarity of vision and having consistent backing and resource. So we've had a really clear vision: trees equals good, and let's plant lots of trees, and that will be the basis of our vision. And it has to be that simple almost, because you're trying to get through to a very general audience. And then we've had government backing for 20 plus years, a fairly low level, as I say, modest level, but actually it's been consistent. And that means you can follow through, you can use that to lever other investment, you can have a level of authority, which means that there's a sort of commitment to this thing rather than it's just some mad idea. So all of those, I think, have been important, and I think most of those would translate to other areas.
To learn more about the National Forest, visit nationalforest.org. And before you just throw up your hands and say, well, shit, obviously we can just clean up whatever mess we make, stop. We can and should always seek to rehabilitate the earth that we've destroyed, but that is no excuse to destroy more. The damage that already has been and will be wrought by projects like the Dakota Access Pipeline is immense, and much of it is irreversible. We must fight to reconstruct where we have destroyed and protect what is still safe from the ruin of oil-soaked colonialism, unfettered greed, and runaway capitalism.